In the ancient pages of scripture, between masculine genealogies and patriarchal narratives, there are purposeful gaps, empty spaces where feminine voices were deliberately omitted or reduced to mere mentions. These women were not supporting characters in humanity's story. They were protagonists whose decisions shaped the destiny of entire civilizations. If you're interested in discovering more about these fascinating biblical mysteries, don't forget to leave your like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any content about the hidden secrets of Scripture. The Bible, in its divine wisdom, preserved fragments of these stories, clues left like breadcrumbs in a dark forest, waiting for those brave enough to follow the trail. Today, we'll dive into these forgotten narratives, exploring not just who these women were, but why their stories were kept in the shadows. This is not a study of rebellion against faith, but rather a journey of discovery within it. It's an investigation into feminine power that was so significant that its very mention carried the weight of transforming human understanding about the divine, the forbidden, and the necessary. Genesis 5:4 offers us one of the most intriguing passages in the Bible. And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters. This single line opens a universe of unexplored possibilities. If Cain and Abel are the only named sons, who were these mysterious daughters? Jewish tradition preserves some names: Aklima, Jumela, and others whose identities were lost in time. But more important than their names are their roles. These women were not simply the other daughters. They were the first educators, the first healers, the first to domesticate animals and cultivate specific plants. Imagine the weight they carried. While Cain became a farmer and Abel a shepherd, these women inherited something different: fragments of Eden's memory. Eve, still alive for centuries, transmitted to them not just survival techniques, but also wisdom about medicinal plants, lunar cycles, and the language of animals, knowledge she had acquired in paradise. Modern archaeology confirms that the first innovations in agriculture, weaving, and primitive medicine were frequently developed by women. Adam's daughters were no exception. They created the first irrigation systems, developed food preservation techniques, and established the first codes for caring for children and the elderly. With Abel's death and Cain's exile, these women faced unimaginable pressure: how to ensure humanity's continuity without compromising the moral principles they had learned from their parents. The Bible suggests they married their brothers, a biological necessity that carried profound spiritual implications. Each child they bore represented a choice: perpetuate the lineage of faith or allow humanity to scatter down divergent paths. Their matrimonial decisions weren't merely personal. They were literally shaping humanity's spiritual DNA. Why were their stories omitted? Perhaps because the power they wielded was considered too dangerous to document. They possessed moral authority equal to their brothers, advanced scientific knowledge for their time, and most importantly, a direct connection to Eve, the first woman to challenge a divine order and survive to tell the story. Their lives represented a paradigm that could question future patriarchal structures. Better to leave them in anonymity than face the implications of their documented power. Ada, Lamech's first wife, wasn't just a woman from Cain's lineage. She was an urban visionary. Her name means ornament or beauty, but this represents a gross simplification of her true role. Ada was instrumental in developing the first city built by Cain, Enoch. While the men of her lineage focused on metallurgy and cattle raising, Ada developed the social aspects of urban civilization. She created the first community organization systems, established rules for coexistence between unrelated families, and developed the first concepts of collective property. Zillah, Lamech's second wife, represented something completely new in human history, a woman directly involved in technological development. Her son, Tubal-Cain, was an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, but the Bible doesn't mention that it was Zillah who first experimented with metal alloys. Apocryphal documents suggest that Zillah developed smelting techniques that allowed for creating tools more efficient than anything known by Seth's lineage. She wasn't just the mother of a blacksmith. She was a metallurgist in her own right, whose innovations were later attributed to her son. Naamah, daughter of Lamech and Zillah, is specifically mentioned in the Bible, an unusual fact that suggests special importance. Her name means pleasant or beautiful, but later Jewish traditions identify her as the inventor of instrumental music and ceremonial dance. Even more intriguing are legends that connect her to the sons of God, mentioned in Genesis 6. Some traditions suggest that Naamah not only created music, but developed forms of artistic expression that were considered supernaturally beautiful. So beautiful they attracted the attention of angelic beings. The civilization developed by women of Cain's lineage represented a fundamentally different approach to human existence. While Seth's lineage maintained a more pastoral and spiritual orientation, the Cainite women embraced innovation, urbanization, and artistic expression. They created the first truly cosmopolitan society, where different tribes and family groups could coexist. They developed trade systems, decorative art, and even primitive forms of oral literature. Their contributions were so significant, they influenced human development for generations. But all progress has a cost. The Cainite civilization, though advanced, gradually moved away from original spiritual principles. The women of this lineage, in their pursuit of advancement and beauty, may have inadvertently opened doors to influences the Bible considers problematic. Their innovations in art and music, for example, may have created forms of expression that were spiritually dangerous, rituals that attracted unwanted supernatural attention. The very success of their civilization may have been what made it vulnerable to the temptations that would eventually lead to divine judgment. When God commanded Abraham that his descendants should not marry the daughters of Canaan, it wasn't a racial or ethnic issue. It was a profound spiritual matter involving fundamentally incompatible religious practices. The daughters of Canaan weren't simply women from a different culture. They were bearers of spiritual traditions that the Bible identifies as abominations. These traditions included human sacrifice, sacred prostitution, and forms of worship involving occult practices. Canaanite women were frequently priestesses of Astarte, Asherah, and other feminine deities associated with fertility and sacred sexuality. Their rituals weren't merely different, they represented a cosmology completely opposite to Abrahamic faith. These women possessed knowledge about herbalism, astrology, and magical practices that were considered spiritually contaminating. They weren't innocent victims of an arbitrary prohibition. They were active practitioners of religious systems the Bible identifies as demonic. The story of Tamar, Judah's daughter-in-law, perfectly illustrates the dilemma. Though not specifically identified as Canaanite, Tamar demonstrates the type of determination and cultural knowledge that characterized women of the region. When denied marriage to Judah's third son, she developed an elaborate plan to secure her position in the lineage. Tamar wasn't a passive victim. She was a strategist who understood how to manipulate the laws and customs of her time to achieve her objectives. Her story reveals the type of intelligence and determination that made Canaanite women simultaneously attractive and dangerous to Hebrew patriarchs. The story of Gomer, wife of prophet Hosea, serves as a powerful metaphor for the relationship between Israel and Canaanite practices. Gomer represented Israel being seduced by Canaanite spiritual traditions, a seduction described in matrimonial and sexual terms. Hosea's faithfulness to Gomer, despite her infidelity, illustrates the persistence of divine love. But it also reveals how deeply Canaanite practices had penetrated Israelite culture, especially through women who had married Hebrew men. When the Israelites disobeyed the prohibition and married Canaanite women, the consequences were exactly what God had predicted. These women brought with them not just their personal beliefs, but entire worship systems that gradually eroded Israelite faith. King Solomon is the most famous example. His foreign wives not only maintained their own religious practices, but influenced Solomon himself to build temples for pagan deities. Solomon's wisdom wasn't sufficient to protect him from his wives' spiritual influence. The omission of the names of Noah's sons' wives is one of the most significant gaps in biblical narrative. These three women, whose names are preserved only in apocryphal traditions as Sedeketelebab, Nael-Tamauk, and Adatanises, carried in their wombs the future of all humanity. Leave your comment below about which of these stories has impressed you most so far, and keep watching to discover more surprising secrets. Why were their names omitted? One possibility is that their identities were considered secondary to their biological role, but deeper analysis suggests something different. These women possessed knowledge and skills that were considered too dangerous to document. During the 120 years of Ark construction, these women weren't mere observers. They were responsible for preserving essential knowledge from antediluvian civilization, from medicine and agriculture techniques to cultural and artistic traditions. Each represented a different lineage of pre-flood humanity. Shem's wife preserved spiritual and religious traditions. Ham's wife maintained knowledge of tropical agriculture and exotic animal domestication. Japheth's wife guarded navigation techniques and advanced metallurgy. These women faced a devastating psychological reality. They were chosen to survive while all known humanity would perish. How did they deal with survivor's guilt? How did they process the knowledge that their children would inherit an empty world? The Bible suggests they maintained their faith, but apocryphal writings reveal moments of profound doubt. One tradition preserves a prayer from Ham's wife, in which she questions divine justice and asks for strength, not to hate God for the destruction she witnessed. After the flood, these women faced the unique challenge of rebuilding civilization from scratch. They not only gave birth to the founders of new nations, but also transmitted the knowledge necessary for these nations to prosper. The geographical division of Noah's descendants wasn't accidental. Their sons' wives influenced where and how their descendants settled. Japheth's wife's preference for coastal regions may have influenced the maritime tendency of Japhethites. Ham's wife's agricultural knowledge may have directed Hamites to the fertile lands of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The omission of their names may have been a form of protection. If their identities were known, their family lineages could claim special status as saviors of humanity. By keeping them anonymous, The Bible emphasizes that salvation came from God, not human merit. Genesis 6:2 presents one of the most debated verses in the Bible, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Traditional interpretation identifies the sons of God as fallen angels and the daughters of men as human women. But who were these women who attracted supernatural attention? They weren't chosen randomly. Traditions preserve that these women possessed extraordinary beauty, but also knowledge and abilities that made them unique among humanity. The daughters of men were descendants of the most advanced lineages of antediluvian humanity. They had inherited knowledge about astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and arts that made them almost supernatural in their capabilities. Apocryphal writings suggest these women could predict eclipses, heal diseases considered incurable, and create works of art of incomparable beauty. Their knowledge also included practices the Bible identifies as occult, communication with spirits, manipulation of natural forces, and access to spiritual dimensions. The biblical narrative suggests it was the sons of God who took the women, but apocryphal traditions present a more complex picture. The women were also active seducers, using their knowledge and beauty to attract angelic attention. They desired the celestial secrets the angels possessed, knowledge about the future, about natural laws, and about powers that transcended human limitations. What began as physical attraction became an exchange of forbidden knowledge. The children of these unions were the Nephilim, giants who dominated the earth before the flood, but the Bible says little about the women who gave birth to them. How did human women survive pregnancies and births of half-angelic children? Traditions suggest these women were physically transformed by the experience. They developed superhuman strength and endurance, extended longevity, and psychic abilities. Essentially, they became hybrids themselves. The true sin wasn't just the union between different orders of beings, but the corruption of human knowledge. The daughters of men became conduits through which celestial knowledge was introduced to humanity prematurely. They taught their human sisters adornment techniques that awakened supernatural desires, magical practices that opened spiritual portals, and rituals that invoked angelic powers. Humanity became spiritually polluted, not just through the Nephilim, but through the very women who bore them. The flood wasn't just judgment on the Nephilim's violence, but on the corruption of human knowledge. The daughters of men had become so spiritually altered, they were no longer truly human. They represented a hybrid species that threatened the divine plan for humanity. Their destruction was necessary not from divine cruelty, but from cosmic necessity. Humanity needed to be reset before corruption became irreversible. When Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot's daughters found themselves in an unprecedented situation in human history. They had witnessed the complete annihilation of their civilization and believed themselves to be the last surviving women on Earth. The psychological trauma of witnessing the destruction of everything they knew cannot be underestimated. They saw friends, neighbors, and suitors turn to ash in a matter of hours. Their own mother became a pillar of salt for a moment of human weakness. In ancient mentality, the extinction of a family lineage was considered the greatest possible tragedy. Lot's daughters carried not just their own destinies, but the responsibility to preserve their father's offspring, a man who had been considered righteous enough to be saved from divine destruction. They faced an impossible moral dilemma: allow the lineage to become extinct or take action that violated fundamental moral norms. Their decision wasn't made lightly or from lust, but from a distorted understanding of family responsibility. Lot's daughter's plan reveals impressive psychological sophistication. They understood their father would never consciously consent to the plan, so they used alcohol to compromise his judgment. This wasn't an impulsive decision, but a carefully planned strategy born from desperation. The elder took leadership, demonstrating emotional maturity by accepting primary moral responsibility. She convinced the younger sister, partially protecting her from the full weight of the decision. This act of sisterly protection amid despair reveals the complexity of their character. The geographical and social isolation of Lot's daughters created a distorted psychological reality. Without other visible survivors, they developed a siege mentality where normal morality rules seemed suspended by survival necessity. They probably suffered from something equivalent to what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Their perception of reality was altered by trauma, leading them to conclusions that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. The children born from these unions, Moab and Ben-Ami, became founders of nations that would later become persistent enemies of Israel. This may have been an intentional consequence of the biblical narrative, showing how questionable moral decisions can have generational repercussions. But the Bible also preserves elements of redemption in these lineages. Ruth the Moabite became an ancestor of David. This suggests that even from the most problematic circumstances, divine purposes can emerge. The biblical narrative is deliberately ambiguous about Lot's daughters' moral guilt. They're presented as victims of impossible circumstances, but also as active agents of morally questionable decisions. This ambiguity may be intentional, forcing readers to confront questions about situational morality and the difference between wrong actions and evil people. Lot's daughters weren't perverse. They were desperate women making impossible choices. Eve wasn't a passive victim of temptation. She was humanity's first philosopher. Her conversation with the serpent reveals an inquisitive mind, capable of complex reasoning and moral questioning. She didn't simply obey, she evaluated, decided, and acted. The biblical description of Eve contemplating the fruit, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, reveals a sophisticated mental process. She considered nutritional, aesthetic, and intellectual aspects before making her decision. The serpent's promise, "Ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil," appealed to something fundamental in human nature, the desire for understanding. Eve wasn't tempted merely by pleasure or power, but by knowledge itself. This desire for knowledge is what separates humans from other animals. Eve represented the awakening of scientific consciousness, the will to question, experiment, and discover, even when it meant challenging established authority. Eve faced a unique situation in history. She was the first creature to make a conscious moral choice. There were no precedents, traditions, or previous experiences to guide her. She had to create her own criteria for ethical decision-making. The psychological weight of this responsibility is unimaginable. Every choice she made established patterns for all future humanity. She wasn't just deciding for herself, but defining the nature of human choice. The result of eating the fruit wasn't just knowledge of good and evil, but a fundamental transformation of human consciousness. Eve became self-aware in a way she wasn't before, aware of her nudity, her mortality, and her separation from God. This new consciousness brought both agony and glory. Eve gained the ability to create, to love consciously, and to seek meaning. But she also gained the ability to suffer existentially, to feel guilt, and to confront death. The consequences of Eve's choice extended far beyond immediate punishment. She became the founder of everything we consider distinctly human: art, literature, science, philosophy, and religion. All these activities arise from the self-conscious awareness her act originated. Eve didn't destroy humanity, she created it. Without her choice, humans would remain in a state of animal innocence, incapable of moral growth or spiritual development. Christian tradition sees Eve as the cause of humanity's fall, but also as necessary for redemption. Without the fall, there would be no need for salvation. Eve didn't just bring sin into the world, she made grace possible. Her choice created the condition in which humans can consciously choose between good and evil, making possible both genuine virtue and true love. Eve didn't condemn humanity. She freed it for the possibility of authentic holiness. Lot's wife remains one of the Bible's most enigmatic figures. Her name isn't mentioned, her personality isn't described, but her single documented act, looking back, made her an eternal symbol of humanity's difficulty abandoning the past. Why did she look? The angelic instruction was clear: escape for thy life, look not behind thee. But something more powerful than fear of death compelled her to disobey. What did she hope to see that was worth risking her life? Lot's wife had left everything she knew: her home, her friends, her entire community. For an ancient woman whose identity was deeply tied to place and social relationships, this abandonment represented a psychological death. Her backward glance wasn't simple curiosity. It was an act of mourning. She was saying goodbye not just to a place, but to an entire version of herself. What she saw in her last human moments was the annihilation of her former identity. The instruction not to look back was supernatural in its demand for inhumanity. Asking someone to completely abandon the past without even a farewell glance is asking them to transcend basic human nature. Lot's wife was being tested not just in obedience, but in her capacity to suppress fundamental human instincts. Her failure doesn't represent moral weakness, but the impossibility of completely denying our emotional nature. Her transformation into a pillar of salt is rich in symbolism. Salt preserves but also sterilizes. She became a monument to her own inability to move forward, preserved forever in the moment of her hesitation. Salt also has connotations of tears. She may have literally become crystallized in her own tears of loss. Her death represents the cost of being unable to abandon what is already lost. Lot's wife represents all people who are destroyed by their inability to abandon previous versions of themselves. She symbolizes how attachment to the past can prevent the transformation necessary for survival. Her story serves as a warning about the dangers of nostalgia, but also as recognition that completely abandoning the past is one of the most difficult tasks of human experience. Paradoxically, though Lot's wife was punished for remembering, her own story became a crucial memory for future generations. She was destroyed for being unable to forget, but is remembered precisely because she couldn't forget. Her transformation into salt made her a permanent landmark, a physical reminder of the dangers of being unable to move forward, but also a testament to the depth of human love for the places and people we lose. The women we've explored in this journey represent more than forgotten biblical characters. They represent aspects of human experience that are universal. The desire for knowledge, the struggle for survival, the conflict between obedience and autonomy, and the difficulty of abandoning the past. Their stories were silenced not because they were insignificant, but because they were too powerful. They questioned authority structures, challenged social norms, and demonstrated that women were active agents in human history, not just passive observers. Each of these women faced moments of choice that defined not just their own destinies, but humanity's future. Eve chose knowledge over obedience. Lot's daughters chose continuity over conventional morality. Lot's wife chose memory over survival. These choices teach us that true faith isn't always simple obedience, but sometimes involves courageous questioning, impossible decisions, and the willingness to face the consequences of our actions. Biblical women weren't perfect saints or irredeemable sinners. They were complex humans navigating extraordinary situations. If this content has made you reflect on aspects of the Bible you'd never considered before, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which of these stories impacted you most. There are many more biblical mysteries for us to explore together, and your participation is fundamental for continuing this journey of discoveries.